Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Jo Moyer, and in Auckland we have Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Hello, guys.
And in Wellington here with me, I have Mark Adalda. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Jo Moore.
Today, we're going to chat about transport and infrastructure. And in response to some positive feedback on Mark's big brain Q&As, we're going to give him a second run. This time, it's going to be on 100% renewable energy. So first up, let's get cracking on transport infrastructure and what it really costs. This week, the government announced $45 billion for 2 road tunnels and a light rail tunnel across Auckland's harbour. Construction would start in 2029. Now, Tim, I feel like we have heard proposals about the Auckland Harbour crossing a gazillion times in the last decade alone. Are you convinced that this is actually going to happen? And given that National and Labour have previously campaigned on roads and rail tunnels and we're yet to see anything happen, why does all of this stuff take so long?
Jo, this will be one of the many things we'll never see. I think in New Zealand, when you talk billions and you talk decades, you can basically say that they're pipe dreams. Virtually never have we been rich enough and planned enough to get on with these sorts of things in a proper way. There's a few exceptions, the Auckland City Rail link, one or two others that have gone forward, but these sort of big numbers in the tens of billions of dollars and in decades from now, 6 years before they start, and also when they're addressing needs that no one's really put their hands up in Auckland or on the North Shore for these things to happen. So look, people are very sceptical here. It must have been a bit disheartening for Labour, for the government to come out, announce this big transport policy, say we're spending between $35 and $45 billion over these decades, and for Auckland's mayor to say this is a pipe dream, it won't happen, for the relatively green or environmental people to say this is crazy stuff, investing in roads and cars, for North Shore people to sort of scratch their heads and go, gosh, do we need a tunnelled light rail from Takapuna to Albany? So these sort of things weren't really on the table. Some people give points for being audacious and for being big visionaries. I made a Twitter crime by suggesting that Labour might have been looking for votes with this 2 months before an election.
Shocking.
And was told that I have no concept of the needs of long-term city building by a very earnest responder. However, they were plainly looking for votes. Nationals had a big go at the billions over decades. They've done it too. I don't know where those votes are, certainly not on the north side of these tunnels and bridges, because really there just doesn't seem to be any belief that this is what is the thing that'll happen.
Well, fascinating was that the sort of biggest supporter of it seemed to be the National Party, who didn't really have any objection to what Labour was proposing. They just objected to the idea that Labour would actually get it built. So here's this big proposal pitched by the government, and the biggest fans of the thing is the opposition, which kind of says it all, really. Just want to bring you in here, Mark. The Greens. Fill me in. What is their hot take on all of this infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, Labour made a point of saying basically when all of these things are built, there will now be more lanes for every mode, your buses, your trains, your cars and your bicycles across the harbour. And it goes to that point we were talking about last week where Labour is trying to strike this balance of, yes, recognising a need to develop transport infrastructure in a low emissions way, but not wanting to piss off the 4 million cars and their owners in New Zealand. And so the Greens are looking at that and saying, actually, we don't need to be increasing the number of car lanes. We know that the climate says we need to be decreasing them, if anything. And the best use of our resource is actually to take some of the lanes on the Harbour Bridge and reallocate them to low emissions transport modes. Maybe there's scope for harbour crossings in the future, but they're not going to be for our cars. They're going to be for trains and buses and cycles and walking and that sort of thing. And probably they're not going to be tunnelled either, because the expense of that is just so enormous.
On Waka Kotahi, they are meant to be coming back to Cabinet next year. in terms of how this would be paid for. So things like Transport Minister David Parker's thrown up, for example, congestion charges and value capture being considered as well. Now, this is a hypothetical question for you, Tim, because you have just told us that you think this is a massive pipe dream and is never going to happen. But entertain me for a moment. That sort of stuff hasn't been used a lot in New Zealand. What's your take on, I guess, what the reception would be to things like congestion charges and the value capture stuff?
Well, I think Aucklanders who get stuck in the bad gridlock traffic peak hour stuff probably do have a taste for congestion charging if it works and if there's an alternative route. So that's sort of the agreed position, I think. There's reasonable support for congestion charging so long as it's going to have an effect and it'll reduce their times, but also so long as other people who don't want to pay can get by where they're going. So it's a little bit different. Congestion charging on a harbour crossing's not quite in the same sort of area. The big problem, I think, for Aucklanders is when you come to new concepts like value capture with the targeted levies or rates on people who own properties near where these pieces of infrastructure are going to run and be built. The theory, which is, I'm sure, a highly reputable economic theory, that if you gain, your property and your wealth goes up because of where you are when a publicly funded piece of infrastructure goes there, that therefore you pay more over time. You pay more on a levy or rates. But I don't think people quite have their heads around it because it hasn't happened. It gets talked a lot about for the light rail plan that's going from Auckland through Mount Roskill, or planned to go from Auckland through Mount Roskill to the airport. But the concept hasn't been shown really in any great significance. So I wonder how that goes down with people that they're not sure who would get hit and by how much. Local bodies are a bit suspicious if it's put on them to collect rather than the central government. So there's a few things to work through there when Waka Kotahi comes back.
Well, thank you for answering that hypothetical question, Tim. If you were an MP, you would have told me that you had no interest in answering it. What I'm also interested in, New Zealand just seems to be really bad at building this big stuff, right? Which I'm assuming is feeding into your view, Tim, that it just won't happen because we're just not very good at it, and history will show that. I mean, yes, there's things like Transmission Gully, there's the expressway between Hamilton and Auckland, but my goodness, that took a long time. And, someone from Taranaki still waiting for this bypass through Mount Messenger and Awakino Gorge, which has been talked about since before I was born in the mid-1980s. Why are we so bad at this? Does either of you have a view on that?
Did you mean 1880s, Joe?
Ding, there goes the age criticism.
I would say that I don't have an answer for why, but New Zealand definitely is bad at this stuff coming from
this is
America.
American hot take here.
I went back to America after being away for 4 years, and they built an entirely new convention center next to the baseball stadium in Chicago where there had been a McDonald's. And the McDonald's was there when I left, and a convention center was there when I arrived. Whereas, probably it would have taken 10 years to knock down the McDonald's in New Zealand, 10 years to get the consent sorted, and 20 years to build the thing. And then it would have turned out to be earthquake unsafe if it was in Wellington. So you would have had to start all over again.
Well, before all of that, they would have realised it was actually a heritage site and the McDonald's wasn't actually allowed to be knocked down.
Yeah, it's, the first McDonald's in Wellington, can't knock it down, heritage value, that sort of thing.
Tim, do you have a more sensible take on this?
Well, some might not think it's more sensible, but I think two reasons. One is we're a bit poor. We really don't have tens of billions of dollars swirling around, even in the future, even with debt. We're relatively sort of careful with our debt. So we don't have a whole lot to throw at these things. So when they talk in the tens of billions, you immediately go kind of, well, really? The second part of that is we're also not very good at being long-term and thinking long-term. Years ago, if they've been thinking about your bypass and bridge or tunnel down in Taranaki, Joe, and if people have been thinking we need to do this in 15 years, it might have probably happened. But we kind of think we need to have it immediately or not at all. And it's just a sort of a position you get yourself into as a community and as a voting community as well, I think. Now, we have short terms of parliament. We have short terms of local government. No one's really pitching forward for any great length of time with seriousness and with intent and with purpose. I think these big ticket splashes with big announcements almost undo themselves and don't help us get out of that funk.
It seems like a really good opportunity for me to segue into why I believe in 4-year terms, but that is so off topic that I'm not going to. However, I do want to talk about costs because there's been a lot of chat about holes. We've talked about this before already on Raw Politics and it's continuing and I don't think it's going to end. Mark, you have had a decent look this week at some of the costings that were done by National when they put together their transport plan the week before. We are yet to kind of see how the costings stack up, I think, for the Auckland Harbour crossing stuff. There seems to be sort of a lot of contingency in there. And when you're talking about 2029 starting things, obviously those costs are going to change a lot anyway. But you have done the costings for the $25 billion transport plan that National announced. Can you just explain a little bit about that story this week?
Yeah, basically, worth noting, the government costings are never going to be right. No one expects the opposition to get their numbers perfect either. But what I was looking at is basically for National's roads, they use the latest publicly available figures. And in some cases, those figures were as old as from 2015, quite a few multi-billion-dollar roads from 2017. And National just took those numbers and said, this is what we'll build these roads for. Bit of an issue because we've had inflation. I don't know if you heard Joe since then, and particularly
in this economy,
particularly in the construction sector, where actually inflation has outpaced the general inflation the rest of us have been experiencing. And so, taking those numbers and saying this is the price tag of this road just isn't really credible. I talked to Craig Rennie from the CTU, who's been all over these costings issues recently, and he said, yeah, my advice, if I was advising an opposition right now, would be at least apply some sort of inflation adjustment there, add a contingency because right now the $17 billion price tag for National's roads is probably at least $2.5 billion short just from the inflation stuff alone, without looking at any other reasons that there might be cost escalations since those numbers were put together, in some cases almost a decade ago. What that tells us is basically the costs aren't that realistic. National still says they're going to build the roads for the total price tag that they put together. So it will be interesting to see, if they get into government, how they manage to make the money tree work that way. But
magic money, I believe, is the term that we came up with in the office when we were discussing this earlier.
Yeah, magic money, magic roads. But I think with the caveat that you got to give some people some leeway because these are big projects. They don't have a lot of resources. Getting the numbers right is hard. There are some things they could have done to avoid this sort of mistake.
I think, too, it just comes back to the point that you've made a few times as well, Tim, that it doesn't actually kind of matter, or at least political parties are hoping it doesn't matter, the costings, all of that big stuff, and that people just see the vision and the idea and don't worry about the money side of things. But that's probably a little bit unrealistic, really, isn't it?
Well, we're not very good at the vision either. 4 years ago, I went to a presentation by Jacinda Ardern's government with Winston Peters from New Zealand First and with the Greens up here in Auckland. There were like 12 cabinet ministers there, and it was to announce the 30-year strategy for New Zealand by this government. So a bold, long-term, 30-year strategy. We have never heard of it again. It has evaporated into the ether. Have you guys heard any update on this big, bold attempt to plan forward? And that's what I mean. They're meaningless unless something comes of them. And too often in New Zealand, nothing comes of them.
Now let's look at the 100% renewable energy target by 2030. Kind of. Maybe? Mark, what's this all about? Help me out here on this target.
Yeah, in 2017, Labour had a target of 100% renewable electricity system by 2035. And in the campaign last time around in 2020, they upped that to 100% by 2030. That was after they'd had a report from the Interim Climate Change Committee, which said, actually, we don't think this is a very good target for a range of reasons, and there are better things you could target instead. Despite that, Labour went ahead, made this campaign pledge. When the emissions reduction plan came out last year, that's one of those long 30-year plans that hopefully we will remember and continue to talk about. They changed that to an aspirational target of 100% renewable electricity system by 2030, which basically means that they are not intending to meet it anymore, at least by that deadline, because it's quite ambitious and quite expensive for both the country and people's power bills. The modeling suggests we're already going to get somewhere in the realm of 98, 99% renewable without having to do too much more, that we're on that trajectory. But getting that last extra couple of percentage points out, that's the really expensive bit. And the theory is there are better things you could target elsewhere.
So, Mark, is that 98%, if we get there, is that with doing no more than we're doing now? Is that a natural progression, or is that going to involve the figure I think I heard this week of needing a cost of something like $40 billion to be invested? Is that actually the 2% that's the sort of the big cost, or is it this remaining, I think we're at 87%, aren't we? So is it the remaining 13? Is that, what does that cover, that figure cover?
Yeah, the cost is significant because we do need to build a lot more renewable electricity generation, partly to replace most of the fossil fuel stuff we've still got, but also to meet increasing demand from population growth and from electrifying things like transport and industry. The costs are significant, but they're mostly going to be borne by the private sector. So we get to that 98, 99% without the government having to do too much more than it's already doing. It has an ETS, which puts a price on carbon. Developers, renewables are already very cheap, so developers are incentivized to build them. The government really, its role here is kind of offering some certainty of investment and certainty that the lights will stay on as sort of our generation becomes more intermittent with wind and solar rather than coal and gas. And that's where things like Lake Onslow and so on come in. But the issue with the last couple of percent is basically there are certain things fossil fuels can do, or energy storage forms can do that your wind and your solar can't do. If you have a winter night and the wind stops blowing and people are turning on their heaters and people are getting home and plugging in their cars, you need something to be able to turn on in a hurry, and fossil fuels are really good for that. So the theory is they play a role in peaking and helping with some of our dry year cover for a while longer. But for the most part, we're getting almost all of our electricity from renewables. And the thing, some perspective is helpful here, which is basically electricity generation makes up just 5.7% of our total emissions. And so if you eliminate, most of that even by getting to that 98, 99% renewable figure, you're talking about a very small amount of emissions that focusing on knocking out those last couple of percentage points would cost a lot more than targeting emissions elsewhere.
If we're going to reach some of these targets, this is an area where you need to have bipartisanship, right? Because this is, like you say, 30-year plans. This is big stuff. So there's no point in changing your mind every 3 years or 6 years or whatever. We saw this week, though, from Christopher Luxon, him saying that fully, renewable was absolutely a goal. And then next minute, there's a statement coming out from a National Party spokesperson saying, oh, no, actually, that's not the goal. So that doesn't sound particularly helpful to any sort of long-term planning when it comes to this, does it?
Yeah, National is generally sided with the I guess you could say the experts here in suggesting maybe 100% isn't our key target. If you get to the 98, 99, that's good enough. I think Luxon maybe got himself a bit confused. We don't know exactly how the question to him was worded, but we know he's stumbled on some of these niche climate policy or technical climate policy issues before. He has in his head that we are committed to our climate targets because he fumbled a couple of years ago on that in a Morning Report interview and had to issue some clarifications. And so I think now his line when he's not sure is just to go, yes, climate targets, we're going to meet those. This is one that National hasn't ever pledged, so it's not surprising that they're saying that it's not their target.
Mark, a couple of quick ones. Does any nation on Earth have 100% renewable? And if it's only 4% or 5% of total emissions, why is it such a big deal that Labor would have gone to this big presentation this week and bringing BlackRock in to help facilitate a couple of $1 billion towards what could be a $40 billion spend over time to get this total of 4% or 5% of emissions? Why is that such a big deal?
On the first one, I believe Tokelau is 100% renewable, but whether they count as an independent nation, that we count their emissions as ours, for example. They're one of the realm countries. And on the second issue, it's still worth focusing our attention on, particularly because our electricity demand is going to grow. And so if we don't build out renewables, that means we're going to be building out fossil fuel stations instead. So the government actually just this week has also put out a policy document on how to ban the building of new fossil fuel baseload generation, which is one of those things that kind of helps ensure that as our electricity demand grows, our renewable demand is what's rising to fill it. So it's worth investing in. It's worth focusing on. It's quite an important issue because more and more of our economy is going to be electric. But the question of 98 or 99 or 100, I think, is it's nice for headlines. It gets you attention from people who aren't too engaged with the substance of the policy. But actually, there are bigger problems to tackle than the last 1 or 2%.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you've enjoyed. Tim?
I've really enjoyed, and I hope people don't think I've taken all my views on the tunnels across the harbour from this article. It was a piece in Newsroom by Timothy Welch, an Auckland University academic, who basically just outlined why either the Labour tunnels and the national bridges and roads are a failed strategy long term. We've got to build fewer tarmacked ways for vehicles to go around and actually turn our attention more to having fewer vehicles. It's a good piece, good and strong.
Good. What about you, Mark?
I'm recommending the sort of ongoing series by Matt Nippert into the financial dealings of John Tamihere, the Waiparera Trust, and Te Pāti Māori. The latest piece this week is titled D-Day for John Tamihere's campaign loan, semicolon, Te Pāti Māori election launch probed. Basically, there's a lot of money going around here in ways that doesn't seem entirely aligned with the Charities Act, is what the Charities Services allege and what Matt Nippert's articles allege, and also potentially with the Electoral Act. So worth a read, an interesting issue, and one that could easily sort of have flown under the radar if Matt Nippert hadn't been onto it.
Well, Mark, I just want to chip in here. I was very intrigued by your emphasis on the semicolon in that story title. Is there something about this story that you know that we don't?
There's nothing there. I wanted to get the title accurately. It's been pointed out to me that I haven't been reading the full titles of the articles I've been recommending. Jo is always very frantic right before the recording and getting her article title written down to the dot and the comma, as it were. And I wanted to follow through on that as well.
I think all you've done there is point out that I'm very last minute about this, which is not probably a very good reflection on real politics. But anyway, my recommendation this week, I'll just get the full title of that. Adam Pearce from the Herald recommending his piece.
That's the New Zealand Herald.
New Zealand Herald. Ex-David Seymour jokes he suspected TV journalist was blazed before tense interview. This story is great. This was an interview that News Hub Nation, Simon Shepherd, he sat down with David Seymour on Saturday, and it was an interesting interview. It didn't sort of shock me in any way in particular, but David Seymour seemed to think he really sort of beat him up in it, has put out some PRs about it, and then responding to media questions has suggested that the interviewer may have been smoking something beforehand, but Adam's done a good job of writing it up and it's very funny. So go check that out. That's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our amazing producer, Hugo Stewart, who deals with this every week, our readers, listeners and viewers. Thank you, Tim and Mark.
Thanks, Jo.
Thank you.
You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.